I've always been a maker, and I sewed, I painted, I gardened, I crocheted, I knitted. I mean, I've always wanted to make things and only ever thought about being an artist. So my high school had a terrible art department, and I didn't have any kind of a portfolio to send out to art schools. So I went to a community college, a local community college, which was the best thing I ever did. My instructors were from very good schools, RISD, Cranbrook, Chicago Art Institute, just all very good artists. So I left there with a lot of encouragement and a good portfolio, and got into RISD with a full scholarship, and it changed my life. And I spent those, I used to say, were the best 4 years of my life, but truthfully, I've had other good years too. Anyway, so I majored in painting, but I had good friends who were in the textile department and saw them, not weaving because I didn't want to weave, but painting, drawing, silk screening, and learning a lot of different techniques that I wasn't obviously getting. And plus the upside was that you could get a job after graduating. So I moved into textiles, which was great. 5 days after graduation, I started my first job in the textile industry on 7th Avenue in New York City for a company named New Wave Fabrics, for a woman named Harriet Sawyer, who is extremely talented. And the artwork that we worked on and the fabrics that came out of it were beautiful. And it was very hot at the time. In fact, they were very bold and wild patterns, and it was like 1979 and crazy. And Tom Selleck, all his shirts for Hawaii Five-0 were with our fabric. So it was an exciting place to be. And after that, I took a job. So I was a painter. This is an important part. She invited any artists who wanted to learn about it to go to the mills and supervise strike-offs, sample making, and help correct color and fit and mark and all of that. So I did that, and because of that, I became more well-rounded and went on to become a creative director at my next job, and did that for a number of years. So I was in New York during this period. It's a very stressful environment. The apparel textile industry, in printed fabrics for women's apparel is extremely stressful and competitive. Everybody wants everything right away. Working with the fashion designers it was a hard environment to be a part of, and I was not used to that kind of lifestyle. So I decided that I wanted. A friend of mine from RISD and I had always talked about doing our own business, making hand screen fabrics. So I moved to the West Coast. She was living in Santa Monica. And we started doing a collection of hand screen fabrics for home decor. And we opened a showroom at the Pacific Design Center in LA and did that for a number of years. She ended up getting a job offer and going off to work for like another apparel company, making 6 figures. So we split up, and she should have done that. That was fine. And then I got pregnant, and I couldn't use chemicals and print, so I sold the business and took a couple of years off, and then I ended up back in the apparel textile business, working for a good friend of mine, and I ran the LA office of this company called Fashion Fabrics, and they were based in the US, but they were owned by the Germans. And we did print in some of the mills in Europe that they owned, but mostly we printed in South Carolina, Orangeburg, South Carolina. So I was the creative director of the LA division and worked with all of the West Coast designers, and it was a really great job. Also very stressful, fast-paced. I had to travel. At that point, I had 2 children. And so, but it was exciting, but I also was trying to balance career and family. And again, I was young and energetic and enthusiastic, and it was great. At that point, the business was thriving. We used to go out for expensive dinners. We had, these clients that would give us gifts and clothing from their sample lines, and it was, stayed in great hotels. And then things started to get tough. And we were dealing with imports coming in from Asia and competing with a product that wasn't as good as ours, but was a lot cheaper. And very quickly, the competition from Asia got good enough to be able to make a dent in our business. So companies started to struggle. I was recruited by Cranston Printworks to start a new division, making the same product that I'd made in my previous companies, which was dye and discharge rayons for apparel, as I mentioned. And they had been a cotton printer for 200 years, and they needed to boost their business because they were also struggling like everyone else. And I'll never forget working with the mill workers, the plant managers, the dyers, the chemists. I was so not just impressed, but blown away by how quickly they learned this process after having only printed cotton for the whole history of the company. It's a very difficult process, and we made a good product. Everyone was struggling. Within a few years, they closed the division. All of the other companies I had worked with were closing or already gone, including the mills, not just the companies. And designers were buying artwork and sending it to the mills in China, and they would do the whole thing. They would make the repeats, they would do the colorways, they'd print it, ship it, and literally put my sector of the business out of business. And so at that point, I started to freelance. There were some companies that were still around, and I worked for about a year for a company based in Lyon, France, and traveled there. That was very stressful. After working with Comar, the French company that was in Lyon, I was told about a company in Fall River, Main Street Textiles, that I interviewed with and ended up getting a job there as creative director. And their product was woven jacquard fabrics for home furnishings, for furniture. And so it was a different sector of the industry, but really, as textile designers, we're trained to pretty much do anything. It's pattern design, it's color, it's all the same. So I did that for a couple of years. I also saw the writing on the wall that they weren't going to be able to survive this downturn in the textile industry. So it was extremely stressful there. I ended up leaving there and deciding that I was done with the industry. I had suffered through so many mill closures. And so anyway, I did that for, on and off for a few years. But by 2000, just to back up, I started the industry in 1979. And by 2003, I was done. And I started to paint and become, more involved in the arts, fine arts. And from that point on, I've been just working in the fine arts. And my work started with, painting, and then textiles made their way into the product. I started to frame them in textiles. I started to print textiles and combine it with oil painting. And then the fabrics started to come off the paintings, and I started to layer them. And then I started to create these three-dimensional installations with printed fabrics, lots of sheer fabrics where patterns would, layered patterns would show through and animate the installation. So whatever the subject was, you would walk through and experience it with these moving parts. That was about the time that I started to feel like the effects of the industry disappearing and my career going away. And I started to develop through grants from the Rhode Island Council on the Arts and the Rhode Island Council on the Humanities. With some seed money, I developed something called the Mill Project, studying the textile industry in Warren, and worked with Warren Preservation Society and community members putting together a study, a historic look at the industry here, how this town was built on textiles. And in addition to that, we made artwork as a visual interpretation of that historical content. And we staged an exhibit in one of the old mill buildings, which was phenomenal. And that was back in 2010. After that, I continued with the project and took it to other parts of the region, to the American Textile History Museum and others. Not to go on about that, but that led me into, my work became focused on workers in general, and they were the bedrock of our industrialization, and they were the people that were most underrepresented, I felt, and so I told their stories. At that point, they were also my story. They were part of my history, farming, textiles, all of that. And so from there, I started to look at other industries, and I did a whole series of works with the U.S. military, the Veterans Home, the Rhode Island National Guard, and telling those stories of soldiers and slavery, all of these through collaborative projects with other organizations or individuals. So that's kind of where I'm at now. I am doing more public art. I don't paint, so to speak. I don't really make oil paintings and drawings, except that they are a part of my development of these installations and larger pieces. I'm now working in glass. So I've transitioned from what was a very industrial career in making a product for the world to making artwork that I want to go to the world and help tell stories about those people who have been the foundation of our cultural development as a nation. So this project, I'm co-curating with Dr. Janice Hanley from Ipswich, Australia. And to make this a brief introduction to how this happened was, she was getting her doctorate and studying the history of Ipswich's textile history, specifically Queensland Wool and Manufacturing Company. And they were, the wool was the product that they manufactured. And a colleague of mine and friend from here, who was the curator of textiles at the Rhode Island School of Design and then at the Smithsonian, was over there working with a colleague on a book. And she met Janice, and Janice said that she wanted to create this exposition at this old mill featuring historical content and research that she'd done, as well as bringing in artists and actors, theater groups, song, poetry, and stage an interactive, immersive exhibition. And then Janice said, well, I know this Rhode Island artist who did that. So that's how we got together, and we started to build Parallel Threads. And Parallel Threads tells the story of the two countries and the beginning and the ending, and what happened in between that was similar. Because the thing that created the demise of the textile industry, the senescence of the industry, began with imports, tariffs, fashion changes. During the Civil War, we began trading with Australia, who they were producers of wool that they were exporting not just to the U.S. but to Europe for soldiers' uniforms and blankets, because we weren't a wool producing textile nation. So that started this ongoing trade. It went all the way through the Korean War, but what happened at that time was they couldn't produce enough. So substitutes were being developed. Rayon made it to the scene, and blending even paper with wool to make it go further. And the rayon product that was developed became highly desirable, and it really sort of took over the woolen industry. In the fashion industry, it kind of took off in apparel, and it changed the industry. Wool was not, people didn't want to make dresses out of wool anymore. So really, and that was in the 40s and 50s, and rayon it literally took over. So that phenomenon was parallel in Australia and in the US, and especially in Australia because that's what they produced. So the US was able to stay on a little bit longer, but there were directions that the textile industry in the Ipswich area of Australia and the New England area here diverged. But the overall picture is that they all started around the same time, and they ended around the same time because of the same thing: fashion changes, economics, tariffs, labor, environmental regulations, increased wages for the workers. This is the basis for this story. And last year, Janice and I worked with Australian artists and community members building what we called Ipswich Threads. And it was really focused on, it wasn't the parallel with the US, it was more their story. And we staged an exhibition with, again, kind of a multidisciplinary exhibition with some theater and artwork interpreting the story. And we had historical content printed and a video about that Janice actually had made about her research. So this year we've brought it to the US and we're comparing the two countries. We brought in American artists, actually I should say former textile workers who are now for the most part making art, some not, but they've also told their stories. So both the artists from the US and Australia will be exhibiting their work at the museum, and that is the Bristol Art Museum in Bristol, Rhode Island, USA. This documentary video is hopefully going to tell a beautiful story about people and their resilience and their respect for their heritage and for an industry that's gone that was the basis for our economic and cultural development. So we're very happy that there are so many people involved in this and enthusiastic, and it's been very rewarding. So, yeah, thank you.